I've always been terrified, still am, of water, dark water, sea water, or, river water.
Natalie Wood spent 43 years running from the water. She wouldn't even wash her hair without a witness. It wasn't just a phobia, it was a prophecy. Her mother told her she'd die in dark water, and for her entire life, Natalie believed it. So when the world was told she accidentally slipped off a yacht in the middle of a November night, wearing only a nightgown and socks, the story didn't just leak, it screamed. For 4 decades, the official script called it a tragic mistake, but the waves off Catalina Island hold a much darker secret. By the time she was 10 years old, the fear of water had already been etched into her bones. While filming a scene for The Green Promise, a wooden bridge was rigged to collapse. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous, but the structure snapped too soon, plunging the little girl into the cold, churning rapids. She nearly vanished beneath the surface that day, and although she was pulled out alive, she left a piece of her spirit in that river. From that moment on, the dark water was a memory she could feel in her lungs every time she stood near a shoreline. After that, Natalie Wood commanded the very light that hit her. By the time she was 25, she had 3 Oscar nominations under her belt and a filmography that read like a history of Hollywood's greatest triumphs. From the childhood innocence of Miracle on 34th Street to the tragic grace of West Side Story and Splendour in the Grass, Natalie was the sun that the entire industry orbited. She was a titan, a powerhouse who transitioned from a child star to a sophisticated lead with a precision that left her peers in the dust. But that same brilliance became the very thing that scorched her personal life. In 1957, she married Robert Wagner, R.J., to his inner circle. On paper, they were the most beautiful couple in the world. In reality, the professional disparity was a poison that leaked into their bedroom. Natalie was a global phenomenon, while R.J. was often viewed as the handsome B-movie actor who stood in her shadow. In the hyper-masculine culture of early Hollywood, that power dynamic was a recipe for disaster. The ego of a man who feels lesser than his wife is a dangerous thing. By 1962, the jealousy and the career friction tore the dream apart. They walked away, convinced the story was over. Then came 1972, the second act that no one expected. After a decade of separate lives and marriages to others, they reunited. But this wasn't the same couple. RJ was now a television powerhouse, with hits like It Takes a Thief and eventually Heart to Heart. He finally had the stability and the status he'd craved during their first marriage. But that newfound confidence didn't bring peace. It brought a demand for total control. He didn't just want to be Natalie's husband. He wanted to be the architect of her every move. He became possessive, wrapping her in a perimeter of suspicion that grew tighter as she prepared to return to the big screen. By the time she began filming Brainstorm in 1981, the tension was visceral. Natalie was ready to reclaim her throne as a cinematic queen, but RJ saw her professional fire as a threat to the domestic order he had finally established. He looked at her co-star, Christopher Walken, and didn't see a colleague. He saw a rival for his wife's attention. The man who had once felt like a consort was now acting like a warden, setting the stage for a Thanksgiving weekend where the only thing colder than the Pacific water was the resentment brewing on the deck of the Splendour. The silence on the Splendour that night wasn't an absence of noise. It was a choice. To understand the 120 minutes that changed Hollywood history, we have to look at the exact moment the liquid parade turned into a physical confrontation. The catalyst was a single glass bottle, but the explosion had been building for years. Christopher Walken later tried to dismiss the incident with a story that sounded like a bad script. He claimed the bottle smashing was just a theatrical gesture, a moment of high-spirited celebration where he and Natalie were just playing around, acting like Vikings. He called it the Thor move, but the captain, Dennis Deverne, saw a different movie playing out. He saw Robert Wagner's face turn a shade of dark purple as he realized his wife and her co-star were sharing a world he couldn't enter. RJ didn't smash that bottle to celebrate. He smashed it to mark his territory. He screamed at Walken to get off his boat, and the refined veneer of the golden couple shattered along with the glass. Natalie fled to her stateroom, but the sanctuary didn't hold. Wagner followed her, and the door slammed shut. Davern stood outside the door, paralyzed, listening to the sound of furniture being thrown, the thud of weight hitting the walls, and a shouting match that had moved beyond words into pure, raw, animalistic fury. This was the breaking point. The man who had spent his career playing the charming husband was now the architect of a domestic siege. Then the shouting stopped. By 11:30 p.m., the Splendour was a tomb of silence. But a few hundred yards away, on a boat called the Siesta, the world was still listening. Marilyn Wayne, a guest on the neighboring vessel, was jolted awake by a sound that no one should ever have to hear. It was the high-pitched, rhythmic scream of a woman in the water. For 15 agonizing minutes, the cry for help cut through the mist. "Help me! Someone, please, help me! I'm drowning!" Marilyn Wayne waited for the searchlights of the Splendour to flick on. She waited for the sound of an engine or the splash of a life ring. Instead, she heard a man's voice, calm, detached, almost bored, answer from the darkness of the Wagner yacht. "Okay, honey, we'll get you." But no one came. The searchlights stayed dark. The rescue boat remained tied to the stern. The man with the drink in his hand had given his answer, and it was a death sentence. This brings us to the 2-hour void, the most controversial window of time in the history of Los Angeles law enforcement. Natalie Wood went into that dark water around 11:30 p.m., but the first call to the mainland wasn't made until 1:30 a.m. For 120 minutes, Robert Wagner sat on the deck of his yacht. He didn't call the Coast Guard. He didn't alert the harbor master. He reportedly told the captain they shouldn't cause a scene. He worried about the headlines, while his wife was fighting the very prophecy she had feared since she was 10 years old. The logic of the accident falls apart here. If your wife, a woman you know is terrified of the water, is missing in the middle of a November night, you don't wait 2 hours to call for professional help. You don't pour another drink and talk about the optics of a scandal. You only wait if you are waiting for the silence to become permanent. You only wait if you want the dark water to finish what you started in the cabin. Robert Wagner's decision to keep the searchlights off was a tactical move. He allowed the ocean to do the manual labor of the catastrophe. He let the clock run down until the hope of survival evaporated. The 2-hour void wasn't a mistake of judgment. It was the final act of a husband who had decided that the only way to keep his wife was to let the ocean have her. The sun rose over the Pacific at 7:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, but the light it brought was cruel. It illuminated a patch of red bobbing in the gray swells just 200 yards from the shore of Blue Cavern Point. When the recovery team reached the spot, they found Natalie Wood. She was floating face down, her famous dark hair tangled in the kelp. She was wearing a flannel nightgown, a down-filled red jacket, and a pair of blue socks. Look at that image for a second. Let it settle. A world-class superstar, a woman who was terrified of dark water, was found a mile from her yacht in the middle of a rainy November night, wearing socks. There is no world where a woman with a paralyzing phobia of the ocean decides to climb into a slippery rubber dinghy in her sleepwear and socks to take a solo ride in a storm. It is a logical impossibility. It is a script that makes no sense. Yet, in 1981, the Los Angeles County authorities decided to buy that script. They looked at the most famous face in Hollywood and decided to call her death a tragic accident. They closed the book before the ink on the autopsy was even dry. For 30 years, the world was told a lie. Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and the captain, Dennis Deverne, presented a united front. They gave identical statements to the police, a perfectly choreographed performance of grief and confusion. But we now know that this united front was a fortress built on a foundation of silence and directives. Wagner, the man who had the most to lose, reportedly directed the narrative from the moment the police stepped on the deck. He made sure the official story was the only story. But secrets have a way of rotting. By 2011, the rot had become unbearable for the one man who had been a silent witness to the entire siege, the captain, Dennis Deverne. Deverne finally broke. He walked away from the code of silence and admitted that his 1981 statement was a fabrication. He confessed that Robert Wagner had essentially held him hostage on the boat, preventing him from calling for help and ordering him to tell the accident story. Deverne's revelation was a forensic earthquake. He described a night of visceral violence, of a husband who was responsible for his wife's departure, and a cover-up that had lasted for 3 decades. And then the science started to catch up with the lies. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner did something that happens once in a lifetime. They officially changed the cause of death on a 30-year-old certificate. It was no longer just accidental drowning. It was now drowning and other undetermined factors. This change was driven by a fresh look at the silent evidence written on Natalie's body. The re-examination revealed a truth that is enough to make your blood run cold. Natalie Wood didn't just have water in her lungs. She had pre-submersion trauma. There were fresh bruises on her neck, a jagged scratch on her cheek, and deep purple contusions on her wrists and forearm. In the language of forensics, these are the hallmarks of an external hand. These bruises weren't caused by waves or the boat's hull. They were caused by a struggle. They were marks of a person being grabbed, held, and neutralized. The body had kept the evidence that the men on the Splendour tried to wash away with another round of drinks. The report concluded that the injuries occurred before she hit the water. It was a formal acknowledgement that Natalie Wood didn't slip. She was involved in a physical altercation that ended in her being silenced by the very element she feared most. The outrage reached its peak in 2018. The LAPD officially named Robert Wagner a person of interest. After nearly 40 years of evasion, the man who represented the golden era was finally being looked at through the lens of a cold case investigator. The detectives pointed to his shifting stories and his total refusal to cooperate with the new inquiry. Wagner sat in his mansion, a man in his late 80s, maintaining a fortress of silence, while the world finally saw the jagged edges of the truth. For 30 years, Natalie's family, her sister Lana, and her fans were gaslit by a system that protected a powerful man. We are left with a shiver of pure, righteous anger. We realize that the woman who gave us West Side Story was left to fight for her life in the dark, while the man who swore to love her waited 2 hours for the silence to become final. The official story of 1981 is dead. What remains is the image of those blue socks on a floating body, a detail that exposes the lie of the accident forever. Natalie Wood's prophecy came true, but it wasn't an act of fate. It was an act of human will. And as the case remains undetermined, The silence of Robert Wagner is the only thing standing between a legend and the justice she is still waiting for under the wave. In the 4 decades since the dark water claimed Natalie Wood, one figure has remained as immovable and inscrutable as a gargoyle on a cathedral: Christopher Walken. While Robert Wagner retreated into a fortress of silence, and Dennis DeVerne eventually tore his own throat out with a public confession, Walken became a phantom. He is the third ghost of the Splendour, a man who saw the bottle shatter, heard the echoes of the rage, and then simply closed the door to his mind. For an audience that values the old Hollywood code of conduct, Walken's behavior is the ultimate puzzle. To understand his ironclad silence, you have to look at the professional high-wire act he was performing in 1981. He and Natalie were midway through filming Brainstorm, a high-concept sci-fi epic that was supposed to be her triumphant return to the A-list. In the eyes of the studio, MGM, that movie wasn't art. It was a massive insurance policy. When Natalie disappeared, the suits didn't mourn a legend. They looked for a way to kill the project and collect the payout. Walken, with a stubbornness that defines his career, refused to let that happen. He fought to finish the film. Some insiders whisper that his decades of silence were part of a gentleman's agreement, a pact to keep the industry's nose out of the stateroom to ensure the work survived. He chose the sanctity of the screen over the ugliness of the truth. But there is a colder, more clinical reason for his silence that touches on the very nature of the American legal system. In the eyes of a prosecutor, Walken is the perfect witness because he has never blinked. Unlike DeVerne, whose story shifted with the tides of his own conscience, Walken has maintained a singular, unyielding narrative. It was a tragic accident. In a court of law, consistency is armor. By never changing a single syllable of his account, he remains legally untouchable. The LAPD has never named him a person of interest because he provided them with the one thing the system rewards most: a story that doesn't leak. Yet for those of us watching from the sidelines, the dread lies in what he didn't see, or rather, what he chose to ignore. Walken admits he was the one who defended Natalie during the initial argument on deck. He was the one who saw RJ lose his grip on reality. But when the furniture started flying and the internal storm of the Wagner marriage became physical, Walken followed the most dangerous rule in the actor's handbook: never step between a man and his wife. He walked out to the deck, pulled up his collar against the rain, and let the darkness take over. The rumors that haunt the internet today suggest that Walken knows exactly what the "okay, honey" response meant. He was close enough to hear the water hit the hull. He was close enough to sense the 2-hour void as it was happening. But he chose the role of the detached observer. He treated the siege of the Splendour like a scene he wasn't cast in. His silence isn't necessarily a sign of guilt. It's a sign of a man who realized that in Hollywood, the truth doesn't set you free. It just makes you a target. He watched the old boys club close ranks around Robert Wagner, and he decided to become a pillar of that club. He buried his memories in the same dark water that took his co-star, leaving the world to wonder if the most haunting performance of Christopher Walken's career wasn't in The Deer Hunter or Brainstorm, but in the 40 years he spent pretending he didn't hear a woman's scream in the middle of a November night. The Pacific Ocean doesn't keep secrets. It just waits for them to become heavy enough to sink. Natalie Wood spent 43 years running from the prophecy of the dark water, only to have it meet her in the one place she was supposed to be protected. When we look back at those blue socks on a lifeless body and the bruises that science now proves happened before she hit the swells, the accident narrative of 1981 feels less like a tragedy and more like a cold-blooded rewrite of reality. Robert Wagner, now a man in his mid-90s, remains the sole keeper of the 2-hour void. Christopher Walken remains the phantom who chose to pull up his collar and walk away from the shouting. They are the last standing pillars of a Hollywood era that valued the united front over human life. They proved that in the old boys club, protecting the brand is the only rule that matters, even if it means leaving a legend to fight the waves in silence. The lesson of Natalie Wood is a jagged one. It reminds us that the most dangerous place to be isn't a dark alley or a storm at sea. It's in the hands of someone who loves their own ego more than they love you. She was a queen of the screen who became a prisoner of her own sanctuary, silenced because she dared to look for a second exit. So I leave you with the question that still ripples through the archives of Catalina Island. If a woman screams for 15 minutes in the darkness and the man on the deck tells her everything is okay while he pours another drink, who is the real predator? Was it the water that took her, or was it the silence that held her under? Tell us what you feel in the comments below. Does Walken's silence haunt you as much as it haunts the investigator? We want to hear your truth about the woman who feared the water but was betrayed by the land. If this deep dive into the shadows of the Splendour moved you, please like and subscribe. We will continue to pull back the curtain on the real tragedies hidden behind the Hollywood lights. Rest in peace, Natalie. The tide has finally brought the truth home.